Perfect. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. We're just waiting for a few more people to join from the waiting room before we start with introductions. So if you just bear with us a few minutes while we give time for those people to join. All right, we're getting up. Okay, well, it's 10:16, and as promised, we said that we were going to start at 10:15. So I just wanted to say good morning, everyone. I'm Harriet Smith, and I'm the head of community engagement at Oasis. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar hosted by Red and Oasis. We'll be discussing the next chapter in earthquake risk modelling. We've got a really exciting session planned ahead, and I'm certainly looking forward to the discussions. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dickie for speaker introductions. Just on a slight note, if everybody could mute their speakers to reduce any feedback during the session, that would be brilliant. And Dickie, over to you.
Patty, thank you very much. So good morning, everybody, and welcome from me too. I'm going to say very little, but the one thing I do want to say is that 12 years ago when I co-founded Oasis, one of the things that we were trying to do was solve the problem about the lack of innovation in the CAT modelling space. And Oasis does, I think, well provide a good forum for that to happen. And today's presentation by the team at Red is a really good example. Earthquake, I think, has somewhat become forgotten is probably too much of a peril, but it certainly isn't one that's had enough attention. And the team at Red are doing some fantastic and interesting things. So that's what it's going to be about today, and I hope you enjoy it. And I'm going to hand over the team at Red to give you a short presentation about what they're doing about European earthquake. Over to you, guys.
Hi, everyone. Let me quickly share my screen and get started. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen in presentation mode, right?
Yeah, good for me. Yeah.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Umar. I am an earthquake engineer by training and a project manager here at Red. And very excited to bring you our new earthquake risk model that finally brings sequences into spotlight where they deserve, right? This is going to be for Southern Europe. We think it's a paradigm shift that is long overdue in a field, like Dickie said, had been somewhat stagnant over the decades. Now, this is not our first earthquake model that we're developing. Our flagship product is our earthquake model that is a borderless European model. We call it EQM. It's a mainshock-only industry standard model, able to provide stable long-term view of risk, and it's readily implemented into the Oasis loss modeling framework using the Oasis platform to operate it and using the open data standards. And it's also deployed on NASDAQ's platforms for access. But that's not what we are here for today. We're here for AQM Plus, and that is our first earthquake risk model with sequences for Southern Europe. For the geographic extent that you are seeing in the photo, currently we have for a subset of these countries, but in the next few months, we're going to be rolling them out gradually and will be available, all of this coverage at the end of the year. Likewise, like all of our models, they are going to be available through Oasis and on NASDAQ's platforms. A little bit more on EQM++ during the presentation. I swear this is the maximum number of pluses that you're going to see. There's not going to be any more pluses. Okay, before we delve into the topic of today, I think a little bit of housekeeping is in order. To those in the audience, perhaps not uninitiated to the, let's say, the world of CAD modeling, we often break them down into 4 components to investigate them better. And it starts with the event module. This is where the developer or the engineer tries to put together a database of representative events to draw some statistical information from. And then really trying to get a hold of where, how often, and with which pattern do events, in our case, earthquakes, occur in time and space. So this is the answer that we're trying to answer. And we produce stochastic event sets in view of the lack of observation, especially for earthquakes, constrained by historical observation and geological constraints to generate these stochastic event sets. Now, for every one of these events in our event set or catalog, we want to understand the trail of destruction, trail of intensities, if you will. These will be the spatial footprints of intensity for each one of these events. And these are things like the wind speeds for cyclones. And in our case here, these are spectral acceleration quantities. And what they are essentially proxies as damage predictors. So they're predictors of damage. And we do these footprints, we characterize them for every event in our catalog, and we can model them as random variables to simulate further. Now, for any given level of intensity in any location, we also want to characterize the damageability or the vulnerability of our assets or risks that we are analyzing, right? And this is where the vulnerability module comes into play. We are, again, modeling the probabilistic distribution of damage and loss as a function of this intensity measure that I just mentioned. Somewhere between these modules, we plug in a geocoder. Our models ship with a native geocoder that is part of the exposure model that we have in-house. And among other things that it does, it helps offset or minimize the unknowns in the user's portfolio, depending on the built environment that you're analyzing, right? So if you do not know the characteristics of the portfolio that you're analyzing or the buildings that make the portfolio, this module comes in and reduces the uncertainties a little bit there. Then the ground losses that come out of the vulnerability module are plugged into this financial calculation engine, coupled with some policy terms and conditions to be able to compute insured or reinsured losses. Now, we're going to focus ourselves predominantly on the event set generation because that's where the problem statement lies. And this is where we think that change is due. And it largely has to do with this little process called seismicity declustering, very specific to earthquake modeling. Now, you're looking at an observed sequence. Earthquakes come in sequences. They don't come in individual main shocks that have no idea about each other. They come in these swarms. And we deploy this process called seismicity declustering. And when you apply this, you actually strip the original event set or the original catalog that you're studying to understand how they occur in space and time with what is called main shock. Well, earthquakes don't come with handles and tags in nature, but that's what we do. We essentially strip the event with every dependent, the catalog with all the dependent events and left with a main shock. That is the largest magnitude event in the sequence. Now, to put our hands in the problem a little bit more crisply, to define the problem in 2 facets, we can talk about 2 things, 2 sides of the coin. One is the obvious exclusion of events. We are excluding events when we are trying to characterize occurrence of earthquakes. So I actually failed to mention that any model that we use today that you might be using, a traditional CAD model, an earthquake model, is based on the reality on the right, not on the left. Now, the first face of the coin was the exclusion of event. This is very obvious. Now we are completely disregarding the dependent events, and that results in us essentially neglecting the footprint of intensities that the entire sequence generates as opposed to just the main shock. This is very obvious. Less obvious is the damage accumulation component, and this is essentially the notion that buildings, to take buildings as an example, are more likely to get further damaged as they get damaged. To use an analogy, it might take a smaller punch to take you down if you're already battered, right? Whereas that punch would not be able to take you down in the first place if you were fresh. So it's something like that. And these images on the right side are showing us photos taken from the same location after the main shock and after the whole earthquake sequence. This has taken place in Italy. You see the trail of destruction after main shock and after the sequence. Obviously, this is a combination of the effects of damage accumulation and the sequences, but it's a really, really strong way to show you and demonstrate why they matter. Now, if I were you, I would ask me, well, this is awfully obvious, right? Were you the first guys to stumble upon this issue? Not really, but not so fast. This is obvious, but this has been known for many years. Now, there are some historical reasons to why we were not making the shift and were stuck in the main shock-only world. First of the reasons is that the hazard models that most commercial CAD models out there use are influenced or pay attention to, and they're not made for CAD models. They're influenced by things like design code requirements. And in the case of earthquake design, your design that is informed by a ground motion level for which you're building or analyzing your buildings is largely controlled by the main shock in the sequence. So that's one reason to be happy, let's say, with the main shock view of seismicity. Now, convenience rears its ugly head everywhere you go, and this is no exception. Mathematical convenience is probably the strongest reason why main shock only view is the prevalent one so far. And really, the independence of events and the stationarity in time, by removing the dependent events from your catalog and ending up with these independent main shocks, is what grants us the ability to use the Poissonian approach to essentially model the interarrival times between earthquakes. And let's admit, change is hard. Entire industries revolved and evolved around CAD models for a long period of time, and it's really difficult to change the views of people or essentially the numbers that everyone is used to seeing, right? And you often see this notion that, well, the models are calibrated anyway to damages at the end of the sequences. So we are kind of okay. Hopefully at the end of the slides, you will understand why we're not okay. And this has many, many faults. The statement is a faulty statement. Okay, but are we ready for the next step? In our opinion, we are. For two reasons. Well, research is there. Research has been there for many years, but obviously practice follows research, trails research for some years, right? But research is there, and at RED, we have been among the lead contributors to the field of modeling sequences. And access to cheaper and faster compute is there. It's much easier now to be able to afford faster and faster compute. So we have been keep doubling our computational capabilities, but the earthquake models have not been getting any more sophisticated. Now we have room to actually be able to push the limit and develop more sophisticated models. Okay, that was long. So I hope I set the stage to now shift gear to talk about how we went about modeling E2M plus, starting with the seismicity clustering aspect. Now, we are using one of the most popular and well-regarded and established approaches to modeling cluster seismicity called epidemic type aftershock sequence model, ETAS for short, based on the seminal work of Ogata. Now, the statement says ETAS model is a spatial-temporal mark point process and a special case of Hawkes process. Bear with me, you'll hopefully have a better understanding at the end of this slide on how it works. Now, we start from these background events. These are essentially represent the natural occurrence of events. They are independent in time and space and have no parents and have no prior seismicity. So this is time zero. These events are able to generate their offspring. So background events are generating a first generation of their offspring. This generation, the next generation, goes on to create its offspring, and this process continues until the whole sequence essentially runs out of gas, right? It just runs out of energy and it dies off, as the very small figure on the right suggests. You see that the decay over time, right? Because you run out of energy and the sequence comes to a halt. Now we work out this equation, although this is a very simple representation of what ETAS is about. There is a really lot and many moving parts under the hood, and there's a lot of work that goes into estimating unknown parameters, and it's a really iterative work, lots of caveats. ETAS is not really, it's very sensitive to your data set that you are trying to generate it on. You have to study the existing sequences, and it's in reality is a really iterative process. Now, ETAS comes in two flavors. EQM Plus, that is the model that we are releasing and announcing today, is the unconditional variant. We have unconditional versus conditional. Now, the unconditional variant is the one that has random initial conditions. So you simulate without focus to a certain time, right? This way it provides stable long-term view of seismicity and risk with sequences, obviously. Now, to illustrate a little bit better, your initial conditions, you can have many different initial conditions. This is basically when you set the clock, right? You can choose to start your timer from time X versus Z. And you have many different initial conditions. Each one of these would give rise to a different event set, say a different next year seismicity. And the difference between the initial conditions can be somewhat illustrated by this figure that, you are focusing on different periods of possible seismicity. So you might be starting from a calm period versus an elevated seismicity period where there's an ongoing sequence. Conditional, on the other hand, you anchor yourself into a specific initial condition and time. So the die is cast. You are laser focused on a certain period. Therefore, we are providing medium-term seismicity / risk estimates for the next year. And to illustrate this, now, as you can see, instead of considering all of these different potential periods, we are focused on today, say December 2024, and the next year seismicity now that is emerging from this initial condition set are these ones that know what happened yesterday, so they are conditioned on what happened recently, right? Therefore, the many thousands of next year seismicity that you can generate look a little bit more similar than how they would look like on the left, because on the left, you were starting from maybe elevated seismicity versus a calm period. Now you have a set initial conditions, and there's a lesser variability in the event sets that we would generate. Now, to understand a little bit better the differences between these two approaches, now EQM++, now you probably get the reference, is what we have in the pipeline and that we want to release soon in the future that we don't have yet, but that would be the conditional counterpart. Now, focus is clear. Stable long-term view of risk on the unconditional side, long-term unconditional ETAS versus medium-term non-stationary risk based on what happened recently, based on observed seismicity. As such, we have a long-term, quote-unquote, random year for stable risk view versus medium-term based on specific year that we set. Naturally, EQM plus an unconditional variant is simpler to upkeep and implement, and it establishes a stable view of risk, whereas you have to keep updating EQM plus so that it knows what happened yesterday, so it can give you the next year's seismicity based on what happened. Obviously, it's much more difficult to upkeep. It takes more effort and resources. Ergo, they can have different use cases, right? There are different models at the end of the day, where the unconditional version might be more suited for more standard underwriting purposes, like conventional underwriting support tool or a regulatory solvency or compliance, where numbers don't go up and down wildly, whereas conditional now has really niche and interesting and unmatched potential to address some use cases like parametric insurance and cat loan design, which by design have a very strict interest in the actual next year, not any next year. You can handle exceptional situations like moratoriums, and in general can provide more accurate allocation or support for allocation of reserves in post-event situations. Now you have probably an idea on the limitations. Unconditional version by design is giving an average year. So it's not going to adapt to it's going to over or underestimate the short-term fluctuations because seismicity fluctuates, it goes through phases, right? We have active periods, we have silent periods. Whereas conditional now does that, but it's much more data hungry and it needs to be updated very frequently. Okay, now let's have a look at what all of these might mean in terms of model outputs. We're going to be looking now and focusing on EQM+. Now, EQM++, we're not going to talk about it anymore, at least in the following slides. And we benchmark EQM+ with our existing conventional industry standard EQM, which is the main shock-only model that we have for Europe. Now, this figure is showing a snapshot of an extract of 250 years of seismicity, but you're looking at essentially the events added to the main shocks, or you can regard it as the background rate. So this is not the entire EQM+ catalog, but the events that you were effective, like we have been effectively neglecting, and you have many, many 6 and 7s and 7s of 8s that essentially get neglected. Yeah. And we are looking at something like 100% increase in the number of events with magnitude 4.7 or higher. Hazard similarly increases everywhere, but not by the same amount. The increase depends on where sequences happen more frequently or a region is more prone to producing sequences versus others. And the increase in hazard depends on the metric that you choose, depends on the specular acceleration, the return period that you look at can go up by about 50, 60, 70% in certain cases and locations. Now let's say a few words about damage accumulation. That's the flip side of the coin of the sequence modeling. We introduce what we call a first generation approach to track damage to assets throughout the year to keep track of damage that the subsequent events in the sequence inflict on buildings and damage and accumulation of damage. Now we are basing ourselves off of this methods called damage-dependent fragility curves, and what they essentially try to do is to model the elevated likelihood of the damaged buildings to be even further damaged. In other words, building that is already damaged, say it has a few cracks, has a greater likelihood of collapsing as opposed to a building that was not damaged and was undamaged when the second shock hit. So that's what it does. But this is an extremely data hungry and computationally costly process to handle this at the level of fragility. So we simplified it. We essentially streamlined this for generation one approach for performance. So we are offering a product. So we make sure that we're offering a product where the analyst does not have to wait for days for this to run. That's why we call it the generation one approach. And we are dynamically adjusting damage ratios of buildings throughout the year, right? Using these proxies to adjust these damage ratios based on the work of Garcia and others 2025. Okay, let's now shift gears to talk about model losses. So you might be asking, okay, what does it mean for me? So we wanted to provide you with a glimpse of what this might mean for an insurance portfolio and a reinsurance configuration using our baseline EQM, that is the main shock Poissonian earthquake risk model versus EQM+ that we are announcing today. That's the long-term unconditional e-test with sequences. The portfolio makeup is the following. We have now showing a portfolio for Italy that is composed of about 5,000 locations, geographically sparse, composed of risks/assets. We have mixed construction classes like reinforced concrete, masonry, steel, and so on, and varying lines of business like residential, commercial, and industrial. We apply variable deductible like policy terms and conditions like deductibles from 0 to 15% of the total insured value or loss, which is supported by Oasis, and limits that vary between 30 to 70%. Now, we will be looking at the expected losses or average annual losses for this particular portfolio. And for both ground up and insured losses, we are obviously looking at an increase in the expected loss from EQM, main shock only, to sequences view of seismicity in the range of 25% for this particular portfolio, this particular geographic setting. Now the picture starts to shift when you actually do not only look at the portfolio level expected losses, but you're interested in the geographic variability of the increase. Now we are greeted with a much different picture. You look at the increase in expected loss from one province to another, and you're looking at the increase from 15% to 53%, depending on where you go. And these are just 4 examples in this particular figure. To think about the absolute increase in expected loss normalized by the total insured value, you are talking about, in the case of Italy, something like half per mil, an entire increase, or not that much increase at all, which is, in the case of Trento, it's very small. It's less than 0.1 per mil. Now let's look at the reinsurance example that we devised. Here we will be looking at the insurer's losses net of reinsurance recoveries. So it's important to establish that right off the bat. Now, this time we are looking at both Italy and Turkey, 2 different portfolios, about the same number of locations and a mix of construction classes and residential, like the case with the insurance portfolio. We're going to be looking at 2 different treaty settings. One is surplus, that is a proportional treaty, surplus that is applied per risk at the location level. Whereas we have a non-proportional treaty setting that is per event excess of loss, as a Cat XL that applies per event. And the attachment points and the terms and conditions for insurance vary and not the same for the different portfolios. And the hourly clause, which is an important parameter of consideration, is not included in this example, but it is supported by Oasis natively. So we have that support there as well. Now, looking at the Italian results, we have in this figure the ratio of EQM plus to EQM. So you're effectively looking at the increase in loss going from main shock to sequences. For this time, not only the expected loss, but multiple risk indicators from average annual loss to occurrence exceedance probability and aggregate exceedance probability losses from 50 and 200 years. Now, you see that this line would represent 1-1, meaning that going from one model to another doesn't make a difference in your risk estimate. You see that the increase is not uniform from one risk indicator to another. And one salient feature to pick up from here is that the occurrence losses are less impacted as opposed to aggregate exceedance probability losses that you can tell from the 50 and 200-year OAPs. You don't see that big of a difference in both of the configurations. For red, you have the surplus setting. For Cat XL, you have the gray bars. And as you can see, aggregate exceedance probability losses are more strongly influenced than the occurrence metrics. And there's also a different sort of level of sensitivity between the 2 treaty settings. The picture is somewhat different for Turkey. We're looking at across the board increase, but this time also in the occurrence exceedance probability losses. And this was not very obvious to us at the beginning, but in Turkey, you have a much more different beast that you're dealing with. Turkey, you have magnitude 7s and 8s, very large and long faults that are capable of generating these huge events. And when you have a magnitude 8, it's not the only game in town. It is now, with this model, able to generate an offspring. Maybe it's going to be 7.5. We saw this a couple of years back in the Kahramanmaraş sequence, and this model accounts for that. So if your offspring actually hits a metropolitan area that your traditional model was neglecting, now you even have an elevated risk for occurrence metrics as well. So this is really goes to illustrate that. To summarize our key observations from these 2 examples that we just showed, systematic risk underestimation is not flat across the board, and it can be up to 50%, depending on what you're looking at, your summary level, whether you're looking at a certain region or an entire portfolio, or you're looking at average annual loss for pricing or 200-year loss for solvency requirements. The answer is not the same, but underestimation can go up to significant amounts. Occurrence-based losses, on average, again, you saw that it's not the case in every configuration, are somewhat less sensitive. This makes sense, right? They're less sensitive to sequences with main shocks generally driving the quote-unquote largest loss in any given year. This is, again, one observation that is coming out of these examples, and that is the non-proportional reinsurance treaties seem to be more sensitive to sequences as opposed to your proportional treaty like a quota share arrangement. Then underestimation may vary geographically. You saw this going from one area to another. You might be less or more prone to sequences. Based on your makeup, if your portfolio is made up of, say, masonry buildings that are known to be more prone to cumulative damage, you might be looking at a different underestimation versus another place in the world. Based on your terms and conditions, really depends on where you set, say, the deductible or the attachment points. So maybe you take it to a point where only the main shock really dominates your insured losses, but there is no a priori way of understanding what's that number. And obviously you saw that it varies by the risk indicator that you're looking at, whether it's expected loss or return period losses. Ergo, this hopefully goes to demonstrate that there is no off-the-shelf way, a single way of tweaking an existing main shock-only model to account for these complexities of sequences. There's no one volume knob or an adjustment factor that you can go back and apply to your model to basically unlock these insights. There is no such way. And this goes to also demonstrate how the tweaking of a model or looking at the claims losses at the end of a sequence doesn't give you the insight that we are showing here, because you're looking at a one dimension of the picture and one sequence is different than the other. And it's geographically variable. So there is no one factor to account for it. To summarize the key features of EQM Plus, that is the unconditionally tasked version, it ships with the 30,000 year stochastic event set of sequences with randomized initial conditions to provide a stable long-term view of risk. It ships with damage accumulation capability. We call this the generation 1 damage accumulation. Like with our main shock-only product, it also ships with spatial correlation. And like with any of our models that we intend to release in the future, it's Oasis native, implemented into the Oasis system. So you don't have to train your staff or analysts to shift between or switch between one model on another. It's using open data standards, and it's available on NASDAQ's platforms as well. We really try to get as much uncertain representation and accounting as possible, and we are accounting for both aleatory and epistemic uncertainties in the estimated losses, which are propagated across all stages of modeling, from event set generation to estimation of damage and loss. And our core engine, coupled with the Oasis itself, are coded in C++ to really push the performance. And going from EQM, that's the main shock conventional model, to EQM Plus, we are looking at an only 2x increase in runtime, which we were really, really happy with. We weren't expecting this good of an performance increase. We weren't expecting to not sacrifice that much computational power, and we are really happy to be able to do that. Now, I mentioned already that this EQM Plus that is going to be available for the Southern Europe is already available for Italy, Turkey, Greece, and Croatia, and we'll be gradually shipping and releasing it for the rest of the Balkans this year. EQM Plus, that will be the conditional variant, is in the pipeline, and we are planning to release it towards the end of the year for Italy first, and then be able to also gradually roll that out for more countries in the future. Now, to those who are interested in knowing how to access the REDS models, including EQM Plus, we have a couple of alternatives. One would be your software as a service on-demand deployment. This is where we would be deploying the model on cloud, and this is the most flexible option. You simply just log in and start analyzing, right? And it's flexible because it can be tailored to your needs, and you essentially will be paying for what you need geographically also, like with any of our models. If you're interested in just for Italian portfolios, you license Italy. And with this version of deployment, we are also able to make sure and adjust the model to fit your certain uses, right? So this is making a second view of risk available for those out there who are interested in bespoke adjustments. On-premises instead is a slightly different beast, where we would be deploying the model on your premise, so you have everything in-house. Naturally, it's less flexible, and you would be working with certain components that are predefined rather than really, really handcrafted. It might be a little bit more difficult to troubleshoot, and customer support takes a little bit longer, but you have everything in-house. So these are the two options. We have both options go with Oasis, and the software as a service ships with, is also available through Nasdaq's platform systems. With that, we'll be really happy to receive your questions and queries regarding presentation, and in the future, whether or not we'll be interested in going with a demo, trying the model for yourself. So reach us out, whatever the case may be. Thanks.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I really enjoyed that. So just on questions, just to reiterate, with this many people, best to use the Q&A function. We've got a couple there we'll come to in a second. If we don't have time to do all the questions today, we will pass them to the red team to make sure they can answer them personally. So don't worry if you think, because we've only got 10 minutes, we won't have time to get to your question, because the team will, even if we don't have time today. Maybe, can I suggest we start? There's a couple from Nigel that I think just I want to focus on two of his three, actually, first of all. So one of them is related to, and I'm going to read it for those that can't see the question. He says, are you considering triggered events as well as contingent aftershocks, i.e. those types of events that would occur anyway, but being brought forward in time by the main shocks? That's question number one for the red team.
Yes, we are not only adding aftershocks, but in general, all types of events. As Omer said earlier, in nature, earthquakes have no labels. So when he mentioned the background seismicity can generate sequences, and in these sequences there might be earthquakes, the magnitude larger than the parent earthquake. And in terms spatially, also the distribution of the distance between the triggered events, or in general all the events, the children events, and the parent ones, it goes beyond just the rupture of the first event. So you can actually trigger events on adjacent faults.
That's great, thank you. And I just wonder, as a follow-up from that, what about, do we have an issue with the hours clause here? And you know, is there a time period beyond which you assume that these events shouldn't be considered as part of the, you know, as part of the main event?
The results that Omer presented did not have the 72-hour clause, or whatever number of hours we want to put in the clause. So all the events are there, but there is absolutely no problem to consider an event within a certain period of time as a single event. So there is no issue with that. So we would just aggregate the losses into one loss for all the events within a certain period of time. So it's fully flexible, can be adjusted according to the different definition of that clause.
Okay, I think that's interesting. One to discuss maybe a bit more in time. The second question I think Nigel makes, which is also interesting, is how do you physically represent temporal sequences of earthquake losses in the loss results table? I.e., is it a period event loss table, for example?
Yeah. You essentially get the whole event loss table for every single event in a sequence. And the trick here is to account for the damage accumulation, right? So the buildings that are already damaged would get damaged based on this damage accumulation component that we put in place throughout the entire year. So you do get the numbers, but they are influenced by what happened before, if that answers the question. So just to, in other words, building, let's say, a building that may have been collapsed at the end of event number one cannot collapse again for the second event. So we do take that into account, and the losses that appear in the event loss table reflect this reality.
The same level of ground motion in the first event in the sequence may cause, for example, I don't know, 10% damage ratio. But if the same ground motion were to happen in a successive event, maybe instead of 10%, it would cause 15%, depending on the level of damage already suffered by the previous event.
Nigel, do you want to add anything to that at all, or has that satisfied your question there?
Hi, can you hear me? Nigel here.
We can.
Hi, everyone. I'm just putting my headphones in. One second. Be a bit clearer for you.
You're sounding all right, actually, by the way.
Yeah, if you can hear me, then I was just because I'm just picking up on one of your points. I think every event there's an event loss table, right? So that sounds enormously large to me in terms of, you know, because you can have thousands of stochastic events. So you're saying that under each main shock there could be a cloud of other events, dependent contingent events. And I'm just wondering how this would all be processed operationally. You know, for example, a period event loss table. I know it's possible to get that from Oasis framework. You know, is it possible to chain? Does the model chain these events, these sequences of events together?
Now we are limiting the size of the events, first of all. So if we went to magnitudes as low as 2s and 3s, yes, then we would be looking at an unmanageably large event set or an event loss table. But we're not doing that. We're only interested in damaging earthquakes. And we set it to somewhere between 4.5 to 4.7. So naturally, the event set or the size of your catalog and the event loss table is not that much bigger. So it's about 150% more than your main shock counterpart. So it is still manageable.
Right. Okay. So in effect, you have your main shock loss, and potentially there's an aggregate of other contingent losses as well. So good. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Just one more comment. When we use ATAS will generate the full sequence, even earthquakes lower than 4.5. And these lower events can still generate themselves larger magnitude events. So when we have this full sequence, before feeding it to the earthquake risk model, we remove the undamaging events from the sequence. So that's just wanted to clarify that. The undamaging being those that have a magnitude lower than 4.5, for example.
Great, thanks.
Well, one more question here is, how do you provide event occurrence rates in the input model?
The event current rates? Well, we have the rates. Maybe you can pull up the equations of ATAS.
Yeah.
So we have the background events. Essentially, in the ATAS model, just to simplify things, the rates depends on time. They are not fixed, right? So that's why the initial condition matters. But there is the main, just to simplify things, the two main parameters of the ATAS models that we care about is the background rate and also how productive are the sequences when they start, and so the productivity of these sequences. And the sequences we have found that in crustal events in active seismic areas are fairly similar. We have not now looked at yet at the very much details of the subducting zones. They are slightly different. And for crustal events, things are very similar in different places. But the two main parts, without going into much technicalities, the two parts are the background rates, which we can extract from the usual methodology that we have, and the productivity part, which is dependent on the sequences in that particular region.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Look, we've run out of time. I think that was a great, short, punchy presentation. As already said, for anybody on here that wants to get more information, we're going to be sending around some material for all of you. So you've got the contact details to go to the Red Team direct to get some questions and get demonstrations and talk further. If you've got any other questions, we'll pass those on. I think almost certainly are going to be able to hear more about this, and in fact, and the US in particular, at the Oasis conference in London at the end of April. Details of that are on our website. Also, if you want to get other information about deployment options, there are a few more nuances to add to what's already been mentioned, and the Oasis team would be happy to discuss that. And of course, you've got people like NASDAQ who are on the call that can help you with some of that too. So come back to the Red Team first of all, or us or NASDAQ for other questions, and we'd be happy to help. And thank you all very much for attending. Hattie, anything else to finish off with I've missed?
No, I think you summarised very well.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thanks to the Red Team. Great presentation, great initiative. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for attending.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.